Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Phil, could we have the... Thank you. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. I've just got to mention that we've had a raft of sponsors. We've been very lucky over the years, but Peter Ross's event is sponsored by TC Young Lawyers, and they've supported the Book Festival for many years, and we're always delighted to welcome them and thank them for their support. Now, this is a very interesting man, because there are journalists and feature writers who morph into bona fide authors, and today's guest certainly qualifies for that title. He's had huge success with his books as well as writing for an array of outlets. He possesses three of the best good writing qualities. He seems to properly and genuinely like research. Yes. He's properly curious as well, which is absolutely essential, and he's a first-rate observer of both detail and personality. It's both the particular and the personal which have made his books so readable, and his latest one, which I have here quite by chance, is Chasing Steeples, a quite extraordinary resume of the people and the history of all manner of churches, from a Scottish monastery in the bleak northeast to Westminster Abbey and their current incarnations and prospects. We meet a cast list of people who've given over their lives to keep assorted traditions alive, and we learn why some holy places survive while others are lost. His last book, you may recall, was A Tomb with a View, which was much lauded and won a non-fiction Book of the Year award. This latest, Chasing Steeples, returns to similar territory, although this time he's getting under the skin of many of Britain's churches, the famous and the obscure, and unearthing some of their histories. To say he's an unusual chronicler of these places of worship would be to somewhat understate the case. So please welcome Peter Ross.
Thank you.
Now, I know you're going to read a wee bit of Steeple Chasing, Peter, but just before you do so, I'm quite curious about your relationship to the churches and to religion in general, because, you know, I know you said you were misquoted as saying you were an unbeliever, but you seem to spend an inordinate amount of time inside churches.
Yes. Thanks very much, by the way, for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone. Thank you everyone for coming along today. It's really good of you. Great to see you here. I mean, my own relationship with the church, I can tell you a bit about my background perhaps, but I'm quite careful in the book not to say whether I have a religious faith myself or not. I do say at one point that I left the church, but what I mean by that is church with a capital C, the institution of the church. I was baptised in the Church of Scotland, and that's, I suppose, the kind of denomination I'm kind of nominally part of.
But you also say that although you left the church never left you.
Yeah. So what I'm careful not to say in the book is whether I have a religious faith of my own or not, because I don't want to colour the way that people perceive and read the book. You know, I want the book to be.
But you can tell us.
Well, I think not. I want the book to be kind of like for anyone really, whether they themselves have a faith or don't, or have some other faith. So that's kind of why I'm a bit cagey about that. But certainly I'm fascinated by the buildings and by the faith itself, and I hope that people of faith will feel that they're kind of treated kind of respectfully and insightfully in the book. And I just don't see so that's the background really. That's the faith background.
So you're a man of maybe faith and maybe not faith. The Ali McCoy stance, maybe's aye and maybe's not.
Indeed, so Ali McCoy is my role model in many ways.
Okay, well, we start off. All of the chapters have got a different title, and this one is titled Darkness, and you said you wanted to be buttressed and braced by history, and the history in the particular is the abbey that I mentioned in the northeast of Scotland, Carden, and that's actually how the book starts. So Peter's going to read you a wee bit of that just to set the scene.
Yes, I will. I should say that when I was trying to work out how to begin the book, where to begin the book, more to the point, I always had this idea that I wanted to begin the book with a candle being lit. It was my idea that the book would end with a candle being snuffed, which actually, spoiler alert, isn't how it ends. But it does begin with the candle. I always had that image in my head. I think I'm quite a visual sort of writer. And the book kind of moves literally and metaphorically from light to darkness. and it begins in the northeast of Scotland at Closcarnan Abbey. It did at one point intend to begin at Canterbury Cathedral, in fact, with their kind of candlelit service that they have to commemorate Thomas Beckett's murder there. But because of COVID, which caused tremendous logistical problems for the book, I ended up doing it in the northeast of Scotland instead. So I'm going to read a bit from the very start of the book, from Darkness, because I think it allows the book to sort of introduce itself to you. I think I might stand to read, because I like to get any height advantage I can get. So this is Darkness. It was the hour of the owl, the hour of the men who wear the cowl, and the church was in deep winter dark. A monk ghosted in, a white shape in the blackness, a shape that took on greater definition as he lit the tall candles on the altar. His hood was up, his face shadowed, but his quick, precise movement suggested that this was the young novice, Brother Edmund. Bells rang out with an urgent clang, which meant that two other monks, out of sight in the north transept, were pulling long ropes that disappeared up into the tower, calling their brethren to praise. It was 6 in the morning on the 8th of December 2020, the feast of the Immaculate Conception, the day of the first COVID vaccination, a moment, it seemed, of answered prayers. Closcarnan Abbey, in the northeast of Scotland, is a rare survivor, one of very few medieval monasteries in Britain still used for their original purpose. It's home to 18 monks. The youngest are in their early 20s, but most are a good bit older, the eldest being in his 80s. They are Benedictines. They wear white robes. They are obedient, chaste, and poor. It's likely that most will see out their lives here and be buried in the Abbey cemetery. The grave markers, simple wooden crosses, wear so thick a pelt of lichen that the intrigued visitor must trace with a finger the furred letters in order to make out this carved epitaph. After life's fit fever, he slept well. If life is a fever, Closcarnan is immune. Its natural resistance built up over centuries of isolation. There's a rare stillness here, a sense of physical separation and temporal slippage. The nearest town, Elgin, is 6 miles and several centuries away. The Abbey is at the foot of steep hills with a palisade of firs at the top. Hill and woods are a looming wall, keeping the monks in, the world out. Lockdown has long been a way of life here. I had arrived the day before, driving for 4 hours from my home in Glasgow. Freezing fog, ice on the moors, snow on the peaks, a last bend in the road, and there suddenly was the great ancient building. "Welcome," Father Giles had said on answering the door, "to this distant and uncivilised place." Why had I come? I was at the start of a pilgrimage of sorts. I meant to go steeple chasing, to wander from county to county, story to story, church to church. It seemed possible that the UK had lately sickened and been much shaken. It seemed possible that it might come apart, that we all might. In William Golding's 1964 novel, The Spire, a vertigo-inducing account of the construction of a cathedral on shallow foundations, one character observes that life itself is a rickety building. The book is set in medieval England, but those words seemed, when I encountered them, to speak to our present sense of fragility. Rickety old Britain, one hard wind from the fall. I had grown tired of the present, with its anger and fear and lies. I was losing faith in the future. I wanted to delve into our deep past, to be buttressed, embraced by history. A close examination of churches and the customs associated with them offered, it seemed, a chance to reconnect with who we were, rediscover who we are, and reconsider who we might yet be. The world, I thought, would look better through stained glass eyes. Churches are all around us. They remain landmarks in our towns, villages and cities, even as their influence and authority has waned. A map of churches is a treasure map. They contain art and architectural wonders and might be regarded as one great hoard scattered like a handful of jewels across these aisles. People once loved and feared churches as they loved and feared God. Now, often they fear for them. fear that they will fall down, fear that they will be converted into offices and flats. Do they still love them? They should. Even if you only attend church for marriages, baptisms and funerals, isn't that enough? These are among the most important times of our lives, moments when we speak most deeply of ourselves, our love, our hope, our sadness. Churches hold within them Britain's history, national and personal. The smell they have is not just damp and dust, but faith and time. My own steeple chasing began with my baptism at Viewfield Parish Church in Stirling, where my parents had married the year before. It was the start of a long connection with that Victorian building on its vertiginous hill. I attended Sunday school there, wearing an implausible kilt, and learned to recite the titles of the Old Testament. The commuter train rhythm of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus made me understand that words could be music. In memories of those long childhood Sundays, the Bible is mixed up with the Beatles and the Couthie comic strip adventures of the Bruins. Marmalade skies, geely pieces, darkness on the face of the deep. As the years passed, as life scythed its scars, I left the church, but churches never quite left me. For those of us who were brought up with them, as worshipper or visitor, those grey walls and hard pews are in our souls. For those born homesick for the past, old churches offer the consolation of homecoming. And so, as I grew older, I found myself drawn back, not to pray or praise necessarily, but to sit for a bit, to poke around, to get in out the rain. I began to appreciate the wisdom of John Betjeman's words. Church crawling is the richest of pleasures. It leads you to the remotest and quietest country. It introduces you to the history of England in stone and wood and glass, which is always truer than what you read in books. It became my habit from time to time to visit Govan Old Church on the south bank of the Clyde, where I would spend a while with the hogback gravestones and the stone sarcophagus thought to hold the body of a Pictish king. Whenever I was in Whitby, I would visit the clifftop church of St Mary the Virgin, which lately has grown so popular with tourists that a sign has been placed on the door advising visitors to stop asking for directions to Dracula's grave. Then, a few years ago, a month after my father's death, I travelled for the first time to Pluscarden Abbey. I had gone there on assignment for a newspaper, but found that it brought me a peace that I hadn't felt for many weeks. I left far lighter than I'd come. Was this a religious experience? I don't know. Perhaps it was just being forced to spend long hours sitting quiet. It kind of gets inside you. The silences, I mean, sings Linda Perhacs in her beautiful song, Chimacum Rain. And old churches are like that. You are entering a building, but really, it is entering you. Thank you.
Well, we've been introduced to the Abbey, thank you, Peter, and we know a bit now about Viewfield Parish Church in Stirling.
Yes.
But let's stay in Scotland if we may, because you've also, some of the churches you visited are quite common to all of us. Morningside Parish Church, for instance, in Edinburgh,
Yeah.
which famously held the John Smith funeral.
Ah, right. That I didn't realise, actually. I know, but obviously the Iona burial, but the funeral, I hadn't quite grasped that, right. I mean, I went to Morningside Parish Church because it was one of the venues that was being used for COVID vaccinations. So I went there to see that done. It was in the sort of earliest days of the vaccination process when the most elderly people were being vaccinated. So the situation was that you had this kind of big public space, the church, and there was people in I think at that point their 80s and older, often being brought to be vaccinated by their children who were themselves in their 60s, and you would and obviously there was a lot of social distancing and things, so you would see nurses. I had to keep my distance from those people, obviously, because I didn't want to make them sick. And there was an organist playing all the time, so you had this kind of church music playing, and you would see sort of nurses going to patients and sort of kneeling down beside them, and sort of, you know, giving them their injection and then sort of pressing, sort of cotton wool to the vaccination site to clot the blood. And there was something, although the churches were being used for, because it was a very pragmatic thing, they were big spaces, so they would allow for social distancing, but there did seem to be something kind of spiritual about it too. I felt that a kind of Eucharistic quality to that, something kind of brought into the body to strengthen and to save. So I was tremendously moved by being able to kind of see that done. And of course, COVID is a sort of presence within the book, but simply by virtue of kind of when it was written, which was a sort of discussion that my editor and I had a lot, during the process, to what extent we should do that. But yeah, that was my experience of Morningside Church. So I didn't go there because it's a particularly wonderful historic church. I went there because it told, I think, a particular human story.
I suspect too that some of the people who were being vaccinated hadn't been touched by anybody else for a long while, and that was probably quite important to them.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I spoke with some of those people subsequently by the phone, and that was certainly the experience. That human touch was, and the absence of touch is, that's one of the fascinating things about the COVID experience, isn't it? And I think it'll take us many a year to really understand exactly what that did to people and how it affected us. But yeah, certainly the absence of touch is one thing. And I remember when I went to Norfolk in the course of writing the book, because I became interested in, and I mean this might come up, but I became interested in the medieval roof angels that they have in East Anglia, where they've got these kind of like wooden angels carved in the roof spaces of churches. There's a real kind of cluster of them there, and there's a particular church. Most of them are really, really high up, and you can only really see them if you take your binoculars with you. But there's a particular church called St. Peter's in a village called Urpeth, and there's a kind of 19th century gallery that's been put in. So that allows you to get up really close to the angels. And in one case, you could touch it. You're not really meant to, I think, probably, because it's like 15th century or something. But I remember reaching up to kind of touch the face of this wooden angel, and it did feel quite transgressive in a way, I think, partly because it was so old and I probably wasn't meant to, but also because I literally hadn't touched anyone outside my immediate family for about a year. And so just to kind of touch, even though it was made of wood, there's this human figure, did feel quite strange.
Well, it wasn't so much a human figure as an angel.
Yes, in human form, and not like the Old Testament. I mean, also the Old Testament angels are described as being kind of wheels of eyes and things, but more in this sort of idea of medieval painting style angels.
Yeah, well, I know that you don't want to talk about your faith or whether you have it or not, so we won't. But I have to say that in the course of this book, you're at a christening, you're at a memorial service, albeit for a cat.
Yeah.
And we'll come to that in a minute, the cat. But you've spent a lot of time in churches and in church services, and so you've obviously been affected to some extent.
Well, I mean, when you go to a church service, obviously that's an opportunity to consider the matters of life and death and the beyond, isn't it? So you're kind of in travelling around the country, going to churches all the time and attending church services, you're constantly considering these things. But the way I was affected by it wasn't so much by the liturgy that I was experiencing as by the people that I was meeting. So like the people in these places that put the show on the road and make the thing happen are often, particularly in small places, in villages in the countryside, they're members of tiny congregations, and often the churches that they are attending have been there getting on for 1,000 years sometimes, and those people, whether they are necessarily believers or not, and sometimes they're not, sometimes it's the people that do the flowers or do the cleaning or ring the bells or make the live stream work so that people that are housebound can attend the services. Often those people are not actually believers, but they are. They realise that place has been important to their community for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're determined that it's not going to shut down on their watch, And that's the thing that I found quite moving, really. That was the thing that I found more kind of if you like, sort of spiritually strengthening than the amount of prayer that I was being exposed to. The fact that you had people that were expressing, care and compassion and goodness all the time in their actions.
Care for local history as well.
Care for each other and care for local history, for heritage and community, and trying to create a future for those places and not just a long past.
Well, you do talk about cathedrals being the superstars of Christianity, and you say they're still big. It's the faith that's got small.
Yeah. I mean, the cathedrals are, obviously, everybody knows that church attendances are in steep decline. But the cathedrals, because they're tourist destinations, apart from anything else, do seem to still draw enormous crowds a lot of the time. And it's not surprising because they are fabulous spaces with tremendous architectural features and kind of and impressive works of art in them and so on. But also they seem to be good spaces for the kind of marking national events, so kind of remembrance services and so forth. So yeah, cathedrals I think have got a particular space within kind of British culture that's kind of slightly different from the normal parish church and so on. Also they're just amazing, aren't they? I mean, if you go to Durham Cathedral, for example, which I did, the kind of the great kind of Norman pillars that hold up Durham Cathedral, these kind of great brutish kind of Romanesque pillars, they're kind of mind blowing, you know. I find.
You mentioned the Angel of the North as well.
Yeah.
As being, and it is an exceptional site, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I became interested in Angel of the North, what I did was in that particular chapter that Ruth's referring to, which is called Steel. It's the same chapter that has the Morningside parish church in it. There's a kind of link essentially between the steel of the hypodermic needle that passes into people's flesh into the vaccination, and the steel of the Angel of the North, and a sort of metaphorical sense of steel, of strength and resilience and so on, that I was trying to explore at that particular crisis moment during lockdown. And one of the difficulties of the book, particularly in the early stages, was not being able to really talk to anyone very closely because we were having to socially distance. So one of the things that I did was I decided to kind of walk from the Angel of the North to Durham Cathedral.
Which is quite a schlep.
It is quite a schlep, yeah. I was a wee bit younger then, but it was a tremendous experience actually. Kind of walking through the snow, through this kind of winter's day, and through the fields and everything. Essentially, kind of following, part of it was following the path that the coffin of St Cuthbert had taken, where it went when it was taken ultimately from Holy Island, and then eventually to Durham Cathedral. Following part of that, what they think is that kind of coffin route. But the link between the Angel of the North and Durham Cathedral is that they're both shrines, which I didn't actually realise until I went to the Angel of the North. When I went there for kind of sunrise on Epiphany, I noticed that the trees that had been planted to kind of screen the angel from the road had all been hung with Christmas decorations and little kind of bits of paper and things like commemorating people who had died. So basically a shrine, a secular shrine of some, in fact secular is really the wrong word, but a shrine had kind of grown up in the shadow of the Angel of the North because people, I assume, saw something protective about that angel and felt that it was a good place to remember kind of people that they had loved and lost. And of course, Durham Cathedral is where St Cuthbert's shrine is, so people can go there and make pilgrimage to St Cuthbert's shrine. So it was a way of kind of connecting something from the 21st century to something from the kind of
though there was a pragmatic reason for the trees, it was because motorists kept looking at you.
Yeah, so it was to try to sort of stop kind of motorists from getting distracted. But that was my idea, was to try and connect these two similar human experiences which were separated by centuries.
Well, seeing we're on cathedrals for the moment, I promised you the cat. Southwark Cathedral had a cat which was called fabulously Durkin's Magnificat.
Yeah, yeah. Do people know Dorkin's Magnificat? Do you kind of know that cat? Has anyone read that chapter in the book? Okay.
They will.
Okay. People tell me that's the one that they cry at because of the wee cat.
Well, I've got a dog, so I didn't cry.
Dog owners are hard-hearted, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dorkins Magnificat was a stray cat that used to keep itself alive by hunting rats around Borough Market next to Southwark Cathedral in London. And then one day, a very, very wet day, it sort of took shelter in the cathedral, and it just never left. So the verger noticed it sort of like soaking wet, sitting in the doorway, and he let it come in and give it some food, and it just stuck around, and it became a sort of a mascot for the cathedral. I mean, that makes it sound a bit more cynical in a way than it was. It was really something in need of shelter being given shelter, even though it was just a wee cat, right?
You described it as part brand ambassador, part evangelist, and part gateway drug.
Yeah, because people would come in. Well, the brand ambassador bit is because they started to use it on their social media and say, you know, Dorkins Magnificat, this is Dorkins Magnificat, and people would go into the church to try to meet the cat. But the cat didn't like people, so those were generally disappointing missions. But also it kind of brought people, you know, for some people it's a challenging thing to go into the church. And as I understand it, Dorkins Magnificat was a kind of way in for some people. They would go into the church to see the cat, but they would find some kind of comfort or meaning in there. It spent many a year living in the cathedral until eventually it began to lose its sight and was taken into the home of the verger who had first brought it into the cathedral. And it spent, you know, the rest of its life, which was I think maybe about 18 months, in his home, which is very near the cathedral. And I was fortunate enough to meet Dorkins.
Congratulations.
In the verger's home. And then Dorkins died during the pandemic, when it was, if you remember, there was limited numbers of people that could attend funerals and so on. They had a memorial service for the cat within Southwark Cathedral, within this gigantic, grand, historic space. You know, one of London's great.
Which caused a bit of a stushy.
It did cause a stushy, yeah, because people were saying. It was obviously a very sensitive and raw time, and some people felt that it wasn't right that such things were being lavished on a dumb animal, you know, to use quotes, at a time when humans were dying in such numbers. But they live streamed the funeral. It was a memorial service. They live streamed it, and some people found that were kind of like actually grieving the cat, even though they never met it. And I think that's because I think at that time a lot of people felt like they couldn't grieve, or their emotions were blocked in some way, you know. And the cat offered some kind of like purging of that. But I think there's something about a cat in a cathedral that I find quite, you know, I like it. It seems on one level a bit ridiculous, but also there's something about those animals, those little animals in this big space, those little animals full of kind of grace, if you like, you know, physical grace and maybe spiritual grace.
Well, the bit that I liked about that whole chapter was when you said that when at the Dean's funeral, the cat had spent the night before lying underneath the coffin.
Yeah, the previous Dean, that's right. The cat had
so much for dumb animals.
Yes, exactly. The cat had somehow known that the Dean he lay in sort of state, if you will, the night before his funeral. He lay in the nave in his coffin, and the cat spent the night sitting underneath the coffin. And then only left after the service the next day. So it was somehow aware that he was present but also absent. Who knows what goes on in the mind and soul of a cat, but something was going on.
Well, you've obviously thought he's got a soul anyway.
No.
I'm going to say something you might find sacrilegious, which is, you know, we were all familiar in this neck of the woods with St Peter's Seminary, which had a very brief life, just 4 years, I think. You said, and it was a victim, you said, of both water ingress and too few men wanting to become priests. So abandoned, you said, by the living and the dead. Now, the bit that, I mean, I know some people are passionate about St Peter's Seminary. I am not that person. I just think it's an ugly, brutalist piece of concrete.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's kind of there's a difference. Do people know it well? Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a massive difference of opinion between how people feel about the place aesthetically and how and what they think ought to happen with it. I mean, I think there's something very striking about it in its ruinous state, but I appreciate that it's kind of massively problematic. But at the same time, it is clearly architecturally significant within the Scottish context, right? Part of the kind of isn't it? You may not like it, but it's part of an important architectural movement, you see, and that's, I guess, why it's got that listed status.
Aye, well, right.
I mean, so we're not going to visit it, are we not?
We're not. You're absolutely right. But what I did envy you was visiting Cookham Churchyard, which is the site of Stanley Spencer's resurrection. 5'2" of artistic eccentricity, you said of him.
Yeah. I mean, so Cookham is where Stanley Spencer, the painter, lived and died, and his most famous painting is probably the painting of the resurrection in Cookham. It's in Tate Britain's gigantic painting. So yeah, it was wonderful to be able to go there and see that.
For people who haven't seen the painting, just explain it.
I mean, it's literally a painting of Cookham Churchyard, fairly realistic depiction of it. It's slightly kind of modernist in style, but fairly realistic, I would say. And essentially the dead are rising from their graves and seem to be having a jolly good time doing so, you know.
Cheery wee chapter, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm fascinated in the relationship between art and churches, you know. Like there's a chapter, in that same chapter I visit a church down in Surrey that's got this medieval wall painting on the wall. It's this 12th century, giant 12th century painting of sinners being sort of tortured by demons, essentially. It's kind of red ochre painting on the wall, and a really extraordinary thing. And you know, if they could somehow take that off the wall, it would be a national art and historic treasure. You know, it would be in the British Museum or the National Gallery. But the fact is, it's in this tiny little, you know, church in the middle of nowhere, and it's on the wall. And that's the thing about churches. I think that I find one of the things I find really interesting about them is that some of them have these kind of, you know, museum and gallery level kind of works of art in them, and yet they're kind of scattered and you can just go in for free. But they also have kind of kids' birthday parties, and so it's the kind of informality of it that I quite like.
But I mean, I love the phrase you used about, you said these churches enclose the deep past and keep the centuries penned in like sheep.
Yes. I mean, that is how I feel about them. You know, especially with the book's got a real interest in sort of in time. I think that's a really kind of key thing within it, and also the idea of churches as kind of enclosing spaces that kind of hold things in, and I think that's true. In the sense of when you go into an old church, especially I think when you go in there alone, I don't know if anybody has this experience, there's something that you can kind of, the stuff you can sense physically and the stuff you can also feel. So I think entering an old church is a kind of sensory experience in a way. There's that smell, isn't there, which is a kind of weird mix of kind of mouldering prayer books and bat droppings and dust. But there's also a kind of feeling, I think, and that is for me to do with the fact it's not that they're the house of God, it's the fact that people for centuries have believed them to be the house of God. So they've gone there at times, they've gone there with feelings of love, say when they're getting married, or they've gone there with feelings of grief when they're burying people, or feelings of kind of hope and anxiety when they're baptising their children, or they've gone there to kind of praise God, so they're in that kind of worshipful space, or to kind of question their belief, so they're in that kind of quizzical space. And I feel like all of that emotion has somehow soaked into the walls, as if this church is a kind of sponge or a receiver, and then we feel that. So when you kind of walk into an old church, what you feel is that kind of accumulated ache of human experience. And that's why I think they're important buildings. You know, that's why I think they're important spaces, I should say. You know, the book's not really doing any kind of special pleading for Christianity. It's saying that the buildings are important. And that's
they were
why.
important to the local community, obviously. One of the things that I found really striking about you wrote was in England, they'd lost some 2,000 churches, you said, but the extraordinary thing was that 500 of them were actually demolished.
Yeah, I'll try to see if I find that actual...
I mean, it takes a...
Yeah,
Even I wouldn't take a hammer to a church.
It says, yeah, between 1969 and 2021, the Church of England disposed of 2,013 churches, of which 500 were demolished. And obviously we're just talking there specifically about the Church of England, and we're only talking about England, and you know that sort of picture is reflected in Wales especially, but also in Scotland, as we know. And I feel like this is obviously some kind of crisis, isn't it, in terms of what's happening to church buildings. And yeah, I just I guess that was one of the impulses for wanting to write the book. I'm quite drawn to passing things. I think I've got a kind of feeling for the elegiac, right? And I definitely felt like with this book, what I was trying to do was write about something that was beginning to ultimately kind of pass from view. You know, that process, which has been going on for a long time, is accelerating. It accelerated during COVID, and it continues to do so. And so it's trying to get down on paper what's important about these places while we still have them. Actually,
one of the most extraordinary stories in the book, and there's lots of extraordinary stories in the book, but one of them that resonated with me was when you went to Glastonbury, but not for the usual obvious reasons.
What are those obvious reasons?
Well, I think we know that most people go to Glastonbury. I mean, the tickets sold out in half an hour, so...
Yeah, so
it wasn't for going to church.
Yeah, so I went to Glastonbury, the town, rather than the festival, because I'm interested in the fact that it's a place where it seems to me that kind of paganism and kind of Christianity, thank you, sort of shade into one another and have a kind of mutual tolerance of one another. So I went to an Imbolc ceremony in February to sort of, in one of the kind of holy wells that they have there, a sort of ceremony where they kind of welcome in the spring, essentially. But yeah, you've got the sort of this Bridget the saint and Bridget the kind of pagan goddess are kind of linked figures within Glastonbury, and I really was quite keen to explore that. I think it's a fascinating place.
And you met some really interesting people at the pagan ceremony.
Well, yeah, just people that were taking part in the ceremony and druids and so on. You know, I hope that the book.
Only you could say druids and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the book. One of the things about my work generally is that I'm really interested in trying to talk to a lot of people. Yeah, let me just read the start of this. It's just about the druid. This is how the Glastonbury bit starts. I had turned onto Wellhouse Lane and was walking up the hill when I noticed a druid struggling to open the boot of his Nissan.
As they do.
I'll leave it there. But I really want to try to speak to loads of people and put them into the book. I guess my books are kind of closest to being kind of travel books. I guess that's the genre that they're closest to. I don't know that they're quite that, but I think that's the genre they're closest to. And I don't really like the sort of travel book where it's just a guy wandering around being wry about things for 80,000 words. I like to hear from other people. I think it makes the books more interesting because it gives readers a rest from your voice. I mean, it's all told obviously through my eyes and ears and perceptions anyway, so why put myself in it? So I like to kind of have other people telling their stories in there. There's something kind of democratic about that as well, I think, you know. So yeah, it's important to me to try to do a lot of interviewing and to really talk to people who will bring every page to life if I can, you know. So I do think about I mean, some of the people are just people that I'm bumping into, but others are interviews that I've actually set up and done formally. And I'm thinking about how do I cast this book, if you like, even though they're real people. I want people who are going to really, shine on the page.
Yeah, and they do, of course. But there was only one chapter that I found problematical, which is called Bone. I mean, they're all called something. There's one on bats you'll be thrilled to learn. But the one on Bone is really about relics.
Yeah.
But I mean, human relics, like a hand in a bell jar minus a bit of the pinky because it was given to a rich Catholic family who'd contributed.
Yeah.
I mean, is that not a wee bit odd?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a long history of kind of the worship of relics within kind of Christianity that kind of goes back a long way and continues even now. I mean, this is the thing. I'm not trying to defend the practice. I'm not trying to, in no way, at any point in the book, am I trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm basically saying, here are these fascinating aspects of kind of human life. Let's have a wee look at them, So I don't say that to pray at a relic means that the saint in question is going to intercede on your behalf with God. I'm saying, let's go to the service where a sort of silver reliquary is brought out holding a bone of St. Patrick and see what that's like. Or let's talk to the nun who shows visitors the sort of mummified hand that you're talking about, because that hand was it's the hand of St. Margaret Clitheroe, who was executed for refusing to give up her Catholic faith in York, and apparently her execution, some people will say, was witnessed by Guy Fawkes, who was a teenager there at the time, and that might have been the kind of radicalising event that made him eventually want to try to pull up Parliament. It's amazing, these connections. But she was executed, and parts of her body were taken because they could be used to demonstrate, I suppose, resistance, the need to resist that kind of religious tyranny, and as a sort of as kind of objects of faith. So yeah, I'm not saying they work. I'm just saying they're fascinating.
Well, there was also the priest's right hand on the altar at Ashton and Makerfield.
Yeah, that people think kind of cures cancers and things. Yeah.
Yes, but is that not a bit odd?
Well, I mean, again, isn't the whole thing odd? I mean, isn't like worshipping the man in the sky odd? It is if you look at it in a certain way. But I just think it's part of human experience to try and seek meaning in this life. In whichever way we can. And if people do that if people's kind of relationship with God takes relics as the conduit, then I don't really see that as being problematic.
Do you have a relationship?
With God? You keep asking me that.
I know. I keep hoping you're going to answer me.
No, I'm not going to, for the reasons said.
Okay. But I did find that chapter on bone really disconcerting.
Because of the physical stuff, do you mean? Yeah,
because, I mean, the idea of taking a hand and then chopping off a pinky and giving it to somebody who's giving you a bit of dosh, it sounds a bit Trumpian.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, so we'll better take some questions from the audience, I think. And there we've got a man with a mic. Have we got a question for the man with the mic? Yes, there's a...
Well, I've got to express a professional interest here, Ruth, but what do you make of St Andrews then? Because I've got a load of wee bones of him.
That's a question to you, I think. What do you think?
I don't have any views on bones at all.
Peter, I haven't read your book yet, but I don't know if you're covering maybe modern approaches to churches. And I just wondered what you make of the move to probably much more functional places of worship or Christian groups, and what you think is gained and lost by that.
You mean like the use of churches for things like food banks and so on?
No, sorry, I meant in terms of even the building styles won't be anything like as elaborate.
Yeah.
We'll go for functional builds that can be multi-purpose use and so on. And,
Well, I mean,
wonder what you
yeah.
do on that.
I mean, part of my interest in churches is, I suppose, aesthetic. You know, I think that there is something about, particularly with kind of country churches, I think there is something about the sight of a kind of tower or steeple in the landscape that is just part of the whole, you know, rural scene. It just seems to somehow kind of complete the picture for me. And so I am sort of drawn to these places from a kind of, because they're beautiful, I think. And I suppose modern churches, contemporary churches, are arguably much less so. I think, you know, I find something attractive in the kind of brutalist ones that you don't. I mean, particularly St Bride's in East Kilbride, which looks like a kind of factory almost in some ways, but is kind of an amazing kind of statement, I think. And also, there's one in Cumbernauld, Sacred Heart in Cumbernauld, which looks really, really ugly from outside. I see one or two people nodding and maybe know it. It looks like a sort of concrete bunker from outside, but it's got these incredible stained glass windows that you only see when you kind of go inside it. Quite modern in style. I think they were done in the 50s, and they're actually incredibly beautiful. And I think one of the great artistic sites in the whole of Scotland, really. But you'd have to go to this sort of brutalist box in Cumbernauld to see them. So I think even sort of like quite unassuming and unlikely spaces can have stuff in them that can be appreciated.
I was going to ask you if after all these hundreds of churches up and down the land that you've now visited, do you have a favourite?
I mean, I like different things in different spaces. So, like Kilpeck Church in Herefordshire is a church in the Romanesque style. So it's got all this kind of incredible, I think, 11th, 12th century carving around it. Gargoyles and shilling-a-gigs and so on and so forth. And it's just a kind of riot of writhing forms, and it's really, really exciting to kind of see. But also, I mean, I know everybody knows it, but Westminster Abbey, I think even though it's like ubiquitous in our culture, almost Westminster Abbey, I think there is something about being able to go into the kind of shrine of St Edward the Confessor behind the main altar. And in that tiny little space, you know, smaller than this stage, there's, you know, the kind of tomb of Richard II and Henry V and, you know, Edward I and so many kind of kings and queens that are just around you. You know, there's something kind of remarkable about that. I think I love the fact that they had Laurence Olivier's memorial service in Westminster Abbey when he died, and they as part of that they played his Agincourt speech from Henry V. So like you saw, like if you look at the footage, it's all these kind of great actors listening to Olivier, you know, do the Band of Brothers speech, kind of rolling around this great space and passing over the kind of tomb of Henry V himself. You know, a remarkable thing. So yeah, I mean, I like the little country ones, but also those kind of grand, historically significant spaces as well.
I know that we talked about you starting this off in a COVID period, but you went to Westminster Abbey between the funeral of the late Queen and the coronation of the new one. I mean, how was that?
It was. I thought it was such an interesting time in our kind of national story, that kind of period when you know we'd all kind of lived through the kind of long reign of Elizabeth II, and then we were going to enter into this new period at a time when I think the culture itself feels a bit uncertain and kind of shaky, and I feel like the ground underfoot is slightly kind of wobbly at the moment, and so I thought it was an interesting time to visit Westminster Abbey, where the Queen's funeral was held and the coronation was kind of going to happen. I had hoped to include Westminster Abbey in the hardback of the book, but it wasn't possible because of because of the pandemic. So,
But it is in this paperback.
It's a bonus chapter in the paperback.
Available in a library near you.
Yeah. So we decided to do that as a sort of bonus chapter in there. And yeah, it was just great to be able to sort of spend time in there and talk to the people who make the whole thing happen. So like I when I went to that shrine of Edward the Confessor and looked at the kind of the tombs of those kings and queens, I did so in the company of the young woman who has the job of cleaning those tombs. So she kind of goes in there every day with a duster and a little sort of specially adjusted vacuum cleaner, and dusts the
Henry
kind of
V.
dusts Henry, which actually not Henry V, because Henry V, she has to dust Richard II and all the others because they're made of metal, they're made of gilt bronze, right? But with Henry V, he's made of wood, that effigy, so she can go over him with a cloth.
I'm sure he's appreciative.
Yeah. But it used to be that they used like pledge for the effigies, other things of that sort being available. But apparently it damages those effigies, so they stopped using it, and now they just use a little a duster. God, not a damp cloth, a duster.
Oh,
Yeah, duster.
sorry. You did talk about, in terms of the Abbey, had an army of conservation housekeepers.
Yeah, well, she's one of them. Yeah, that's what they call them. I called her a cleaner, but they're known as conservation housekeepers because they have to do it. They have to.
That's a grade above a cleaner, I'd have said.
Obviously, you have to do it really, really delicately. And she goes in with she's called Hannah, and she goes in with this little vacuum cleaner strapped to her back. And like a head torch and things like that, so she looks like a Ghostbuster basically, going in to clean these tombs. And also I saw that they used like Henry Hoovers for other parts of Westminster Abbey. I love the idea that you've got kind of the Henrys, the King Henrys, and you've got the Henry Hoover sort of tucked away somewhere.
Actually, I like that.
It's not all about cleaning, by the way. I should say, if you do read the book, there's other aspects of that.
No, there's as well as cats and crowns. There's bats and bone and fen, and which was where the wooden angels came from. That chapter, and dust.
Yeah, well, dust is a chapter that just explores that idea that the churches are kind of fragile and that they are in danger all the time of kind of closing down, and the fact that there's organisations like Friends of Friendless Churches who look after certain churches, certain historic churches. They're a charity that look after certain historic churches in England and Wales, churches that have kind of closed down, but in order to kind of keep them open as sort of historically important spaces, they take them over and often kind of do them up if their roofs are falling in and so on.
But who decides what is of historical importance?
Well, it's kind of a complicated process. I think the Church of England or the Church of Wales get first dibs on. They have to like decide whether to take churches into their care, and the ones that they don't, for whatever reason, Friends of Friendless Churches can then take on. But it's a very kind of complicated and administrative process. But they essentially take them on because for reasons like I was talking about before, they regard them as being important, like historical spaces, not just because of like their architecture or what's in them, but also because what they've meant to communities over the centuries.
Cited.
Yeah, and of course the thing is that often these places, these churches are built on sites that were sacred before Christianity a lot of the time. So that particular spot in the landscape has been important to people even before the kind of coming of Christianity, and the church kind of planted its flag in these places and built their churches on them. So there is something about continuity of importance, I think, that's important in the book.
I wanted to ask you, Peter, because there's a huge amount about architecture and different kinds of architecture in the book, both inside and externally. I've always been curious as to whether architecture or art or music, which of these pillars of religion are the most evocative?
I mean, I think it's the whole package, isn't it? That's the whole thing about going into church. These are spaces where you are set apart from the world, right? And that setting apart is done through the use of architecture. It's done through the use of art, particularly before the Reformation, when all the churches were kind of riots of colour and had wall paintings all over them. It's done, through the use of kind of music and through the literature of the liturgy. And obviously in kind of the pre-Reformation and within the Catholic traditions, it's done through things like incense and so on. So the churches, I think, are creating they're transformative spaces, aren't they? They make you feel differently when you go into them, and the way they do that is through all of these things. I think that's the kind of purpose of these elements, is to try and create something that's set apart from the rest of society.
I was interested in you having a conversation with Richard Holloway, the erstwhile Episcopal Bishop of Edinburgh, of course, who's still with us happily, but who's, as he puts it, in God's waiting room. But you talked to Richard. Used to be a priest at Old St Paul's in Edinburgh. I think that's right. And there's an interesting story there about a piece of artwork that was done by Alison Watt that's still there, even though it wasn't meant to stay there.
Yes, Alison Watt. Do people know the Church of Old St Paul's in Edinburgh at all?
It's up Jeffrey Street, just near Waverley Station.
Yeah, so it's so close to Waverley Station that it's possible to sort of nip in there if you're a bit early for a train or something like that. And it really is worth doing, because it's got this painting in it by Alison Watt called Still, and it hangs within one of the side chapels, in the chapel that's sort of dedicated to the dead of the wars. And it's I've got a picture of it here. I know you can't really see from here, but it's essentially a very large wall painting in 4 parts that kind of forms a cross in the middle. And it's just it's a kind of like a lot of Alison's paintings. It's a kind of loop of white cloth. And Old St Paul's in Edinburgh is a very dark church, actually. I think it's quite a dim, grey kind of.
Quite pokey, actually.
It's quite melancholy. I think it feels quite melancholy to me when I walk in there. It's a real place of kind of remembrance, and a place where you can kind of go, I think, with a kind of burden of sorrow, really. And the painting just fits in wonderfully with that feeling, really. So I again, it's like I was saying about the stained glass windows in Cumbernauld, where you have to kind of go to this brutalist church to see them. You can pop into this church if you're 10 minutes early for your train and encounter, I think, what is quite a profound work of art, that just contemporary art that just works wonderfully in quite an old space,
Except that the commission wasn't actually for it to stay in the church.
Yeah, it was commissioned for like one of the festivals of art during one of the Edinburgh festivals, but the parishioners liked it so much they decided that it should stay there. And I think Bishop of Edinburgh at that time, I guess the Episcopal Bishop of Edinburgh at that time, blessed the painting with Alison, who isn't really quite a believer, present, which was something that she'd obviously never experienced before as an artist.
But she didn't feel able to take it out of that setting.
I think she just felt that it found a home, really. Alison's from a kind of Catholic background, and I think she's very open to although not necessarily a believer, I think she's just kind of open to that kind of spiritual experience. And so I think she felt it important that the painting kind of remain in this space.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions from the floor?
Can I ask a question?
You certainly can, Jim.
Thanks. I've enjoyed very much your first book, The Tomb with a View.
Thank you.
And you actually did that online for us in our virtual book festival in 2020 here, which was great, because it meant that we were able to go online. So, and looking forward to reading this. Where next? What's your next project?
Right. Well, there is going to be another book. Essentially, I've decided that it was never really intended to be a trilogy, but it's turned out to be one, really. And in a funny way, it's to do with the books, the actual physical books themselves. I don't know if people know A Tomb with a View, but it's got like this fox kind of walking through a graveyard on the front, in the foreground. And if you look at the front of Steeple Chasing, it's got the fox is a little bit further down the path and closer to the church. And I was kind of looking at these one day, and I was thinking, I wonder where that wee fox goes next, And I did honestly think the only way I'm going to be able to find out is to write another book. And then it became a case of trying to work out what that was. And I do have, I've been working for the past year on a book. I can't really say the specific subject or title right now. I think we want to wait till we've got the cover before we kind of announce that. But it's very much in that same tradition.
This audience is very discreet.
It's in that same tradition of being about the kind of marks we leave on the land in stone to say we were here and we mattered in some way. So it's kind of following that theme, and it'll be very similar in terms of being full of people and people's stories and voices.
And when can we expect it?
Next year.
Right, okay, well, we've got another question there. This is Jim's aerobics class, so don't disturb him.
This was my registration teacher 45 years ago.
I cannot lie. I cannot. We're not looking for your imminent conversion. But how do you feel about converting a redundant church for a home for yourself?
Oh right. I mean, I'm glad to see the churches staying up really. So if that means that they do get made into homes, then I'm kind of okay with that really. You know, I'm not necessarily. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I'm about to move into one myself, but you know, I wouldn't mind. But I think it's good that they can be saved from demolition, and that's obviously one of the ways that happens is people choose to kind of convert them into houses. I mean, I think they're often, I think churches are probably the first buildings that we see in our lives that seem to be significant in some way. We just kind of see them on the street. You know, they're ubiquitous certainly, and so I think we from early on, even if we're not kind of come from any kind of faith background, we see some kind of importance in them, whether it's architectural or whatever. So I like the idea that they stay as part of the landscape and don't get knocked down.
How do you feel about the churches that morph into either restaurants or one in Bristol that's now a circus school?
Oh, as I say, I just think if they can be saved in some way, then I'm basically okay with it. Yeah.
Any other questions before we shut up shop? I don't know if you're just signalling or...
Me?
You...
Oh, I was just saying to my friend...
You were singing?
No, saying.
Oh, say.
There's a church next door, I noticed the windows are boarded up. And I wonder...
Well, that was it. That was...
the story of that church.
Well, Jim probably knows more about it, but it was a church hall.
It was the United Free Church in the village until the 1950s, and I'm probably the wrong person to ask this because my grandmother wanted it knocked down in the 1950s and pensioners' houses built in the grounds of it. But it was decided that it would be kept as a church hall, and it was sold by the local congregation in 2008, and it's had a number of owners since, and there's been various planning applications hope to turn it into a home. But I think the general consensus is in the village there'll probably be a fire one night.
Well, and on that cheery note...
I hope that's not a prediction. Anybody else before we thank Peter? Well, would you please join me in thanking Peter Ross?
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.